It feels a little weird to call Cuphead a platformer because while it does feature stages that you navigate by jumping over platforms and other parts of the landscape, its main focus is on boss battles, many of which are in open, single screens. Then again, some boss arenas do feature platforms. Then again, several of the fights put you in a plane for sections that feel more like arcade shooters. Guess whether this one counts as a member of the genre depends on your definition, but hey, I like platformers, I like Cuphead, and several of my skills from playing games like Mega Man carry over, so if you ask me what type of game Cuphead is, that's what I'd call it. But does it even matter? Genres are there pretty much to help a title find its target audience. People who like scary movies will undoubtedly browse the horror section, but Cuphead needs no introduction. I'm Wes, the Explosion, and I've been wanting to do something with Cuphead for a while, so why not a full review? You know, it also feels a little weird to give a plot synopsis, given that the game not only runs you through it real quick at the start, but it also sings it to you when you start it up. Cuphead and Mugman, who are children, were somehow allowed into the Devil's Casino, and Cuphead was cleaning the place out. The Devil himself shows up to offer him an all-or-nothing proposition. Win one more bet and they get all his riches. Lose and he gets their souls. Good boy Mugman tries to stop him, but Cuphead rolls the dice, they lose, and they're left begging for their existences. The Devil agrees to let them off if they can collect the soul contracts from everybody in the Inkwell Isles that owe him a similar debt, which leads us to needing to beat up a bunch of colorful characters and freaks that make up the game's bosses. As you can probably figure, you can play as either Cuphead or Mugman, and the mechanics consist largely of jumping and shooting. Hold down the fire button to release a continuous stream of shots, which you can do in 8 directions, just like Metal Blade. You can equip up to 2 types of shots at once, which you can switch between at any time. Hold down to duck and you also get a button that will stick you in place for more precise aiming. There's also a dash you can use, both while grounded and in the air, for a quick burst of horizontal movement, good for getting you out of harm's way. Some enemy attacks can be parried, the general rule of thumb being that if it's pink, you can parry it. I'd go so far as to call it ridiculously consistent, you being able to do it not just on pink projectiles and parts of the environment, there's even a few parts where butterflies float by as part of the scenery, and yet, these too can be parried. Baroness von Bonbon's castle is about the only pink object you can't. Doing this will not only clear out dangerous elements, but it also builds up your special meter. This is made up of 5 cards, which fill as you deal and take damage, with parrying being the biggest boost to it. Expend 1 card and you'll use a powered up version of whatever weapon you currently have equipped, but if you build up all 5 cards, activating it will do a much bigger move that will use up the whole meter, but are generally worth it if you pick a good time to use them. You can equip one of these super specials at a time, and you also get a slot for charms. These provide various buffs, and we'll discuss them in a bit. As for how you get most of this stuff, the majority is purchased at P.o.E.M's Emporium with coins. How do you get coins? Some you find in levels, some by poking around the overworld, some you get by completing quests, like finding a secret passage to reach a further part of the world early and telling an NPC about it. Some items won't be available for purchase right away, and you'll need to buy Pork Rind's present stock to get him to bring out the new stuff. So unfortunately, you might need to buy some stuff you have no intention of using to get what you're actually after. There's also a few fights where you battle in a plane, your basic shot being similar to the pea shooter, with a weapon swap causing you to drop bombs that drop in pretty sharp arcs, so you need to be close to use them effectively, but they do pretty good damage. Holding dash will make you smaller and faster, though your shots will also be weaker and have a limited range. 1 card specials have you firing missiles straight ahead, and the 5 card will turn you into a large bomb that you can steer and will blow up on contact, giving you some iframes afterwards. Oh, and for all of the modes, you typically have just 3 HP to work with. Once you beat a fighter stage, you get a letter grade, based off of your clear time, how much damage you took, how often you parried, whether you actually used your special meter or just sat on it, and your skill level. Simple enough, right? So let's get to the nitty-gritty. The base game gives you 6 weapons, and the pea shooter comes standard. Despite the pathetic sounding name, it's actually pretty good, it being one of the less situational options. It has a fast rate of fire and does decent damage, so there aren't too many situations where this won't work. The chaser fires pretty quickly and the shots home in on enemies, but it's pretty weak. Spread shot shoots fast, multiple shots directly in front of you in a cone shape. Each projectile is weak, but if you can get right up in a boss's face, the high fire rate and multiple bullets will manage to rack up damage fast. Lobber has a bit of space between its somewhat heftier shots that come out in a low arc, then bounce, so it's pretty decent against ground-based enemies. Charge shot is the only one that doesn't fire out automatically when held, you instead charging up a shot to be fired, as the name implies. While it doesn't take too long to power one up, it hurts a lot more when you whiff a shot, and if you dash, it'll fire off whatever you have saved up, be it either the incomplete weenie shot or the full blast, which is likely going to miss anyway, so there is a commitment to it since dodging often sees you wasting your shot. Lastly, there's the roundabout, these weird horseshoe bullets that fly out somewhat slowly, before arching back and up, them dealing more damage on the rebound. They can be good if you're facing an opponent that you are safe looking away from, heck, maybe even running away from, like Baroness von Bonbon's final phase. While I personally will vary my loadout a little bit depending on the situation, my go-to tends to be the Charge Shot and Chaser. Because of course it's going to be Charge Shot, I love Mega Man. More than that though, I feel like this combo covers kind of most situations. If you're in a good spot and able to face them down directly, you can charge and let your attack fly. Heck, since it takes a second to power up, you don't even need to keep a steady stream of fire on them, you being able to pick the best moment to counter. And when you don't have that kind of liberty and want to concentrate on dodging, you can put on the Chaser and just worry about your movements, letting the homing function do the rest. While damage is low, it'll gradually get the job done, and still at a much faster rate than you waiting for the boss to get into a position you can attack, or giving you a spare moment to line up a shot. I think this is one of the more common combos to use as well, so I'd say it's battle tested. You get 6 charms as well. The Smoke Bomb makes you invisible while dashing, so you're safe from damage while doing so. Can't hit what you can't see. The Pea Sugar makes it so that you automatically parry when jumping into something pink. Coffee automatically refills your special meter, bit by bit. The Whetstone turns your parry into an actual attack that can harm bosses directly. Then there are 2 charms that give you bonus and 2 bonus hearts, but at the cost of reducing your damage. For me, it's almost always the Smoke Bomb. The game throws a lot of crap your way, so being able to get some iframes on command can be huge, and it's always the first thing I purchase in the game. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to do anything in the biplane fights, so I swap it out for them, typically for coffee since getting some extra damage from specials can be really helpful. As for the extra hearts, I tend to avoid them since they mostly just drag things out. Sure, they give you more room to make mistakes, but at the same time, with your lower damage output, they also give you more chances to make mistakes, so I'm not sure that they're worth it. I'd rather just get things over with and either I kill them or they kill me. The Sugar and Whetstone kinda bug me, because I fundamentally misunderstood them until I started looking into the charms more. Each described their effects as being for the first parry, which I took to mean they'd only be usable once per battle, but that's not actually true. Turns out, it's for the first parry after jumping. So while you can't use the Sugar for effortless air combos or the Whetstone to constantly bounce off an enemy, as long as you touch the ground, you can use them again. While I wouldn't use the Sugar since I feel like learning the timing of parrying on your own is vital to clearing the game, the Whetstone sounds downright interesting, with the wiki making it sound like there isn't a lot of cooldown on it during the biplane sections. Still though, you can't go wrong with the Smoke Bomb, and beginner players can probably get a lot of use out of the extra hearts, since they'll give them more chances to learn a fight. Kind of a shame that the 2-heart thing is the last charm to show up. And there are 3 of the super specials, one from each of the 3 islands' mausoleums. The first one is just the big screw you attack, you firing a wave of milk across the screen that does steady damage with anything it overlaps with. You have to be a little careful though, since while you have iframes during the attack, you lose them as soon as it's over, so if a boss sends something your way while you were firing it and it just happens to reach you as you finish, chances are you're not dodging. This is what I usually have equipped since it's good damage and I can normally find a low risk chance to use it in between boss attacks. The second is just straight up invincibility. Nothing can hurt you for several seconds, even falling into a pit will just bounce you right back up. Not that that was an insta-kill anyway, but I rarely use this since, while it lasts longer than the iframes you get after taking damage, it's not too long. To use it effectively, you'd have to anticipate getting hit, and in that case, why not just dodge? Still, I could see some people using it as either a way to get past an attack that they just can't seem to avoid, or as an opportunity to get right up in a boss's face to finish them off with something like the spread shot, so just because I don't use it doesn't make it useless. The last one is pretty funky though. Your spirit pops out of your body, spinning around and clotheslining anything that it comes in contact with. You control it with your directional inputs, which is a little awkward given that means you have to simultaneously move yourself and your attack around with the same input. When I was fighting a simple boss where I didn't have to dodge too much, it didn't go over too bad, but against one where I had to be constantly on the move, it didn't take too long for me to accidentally send it off screen. I'm not confident enough to use it, but I imagine someone with much better control could get some amazing results and it'd be a sight to see. There's either 19 bosses, or 28 if you count each individual part of King Dice's boss rush as separate, divided between 3 main aisles and a small final area where you fight said boss rush and final boss. And as you can probably guess, that's way too many for me to talk about here, though I could be convinced to do more in-depth looks in future videos, so let me know. Beat a boss to open up the path forward, though you can sometimes find hidden paths to skip ahead. And as you might figure, a lot of the bosses test different things. To pull a few specific examples, the Root Pack is probably the only fight in the game that I would say is actually easy, though while still challenging, most bosses in Inkwell 1 are there to just teach you the basics and get you accustomed to the gameplay. You need to beat each boss on an aisle to advance to the next, and the first stumbling block tends to be Cagney Carnation, the fight right before the Dice House, where you need to show King Dice that you collected all the contracts so far. Cagney is a flower that sends a lot of projectiles your way while planting smaller enemies and limiting your footholds for his final phase. Having to juggle attacking, dodging, and getting rid of extra enemies can be a lot to try and deal with this early on. Heck, everything moving on screen at once actually gives my brother a headache. Inkwell 2 doesn't have any bosses that feel too easy for the level, but there are a few that feel like they should have shown up on the third island. That be the Clown, who you can fight immediately upon entering, is another one likely to make you rage quit. Maybe it's all his projectiles, maybe it's the snake and coaster that comes around to mess with you, maybe he's just generally hard, but I've heard a few people curse him out. Grim Matchstick you fight in the air, with you needing to navigate the cloud platforms floating through his arena while dodging his various attacks, so it's another juggling act. He's another one that'll get some people. While I'd say he's harder than Beppo, I'd still say most people that manage to beat him can tough it out with Matchstick too. Inkwell 3 has several bosses that seems like they should have been earlier in the game. Sally Stageplay and Werner Vermin seeming like they should have been Island 2, maybe even 1 encounters, but they're more on theme here. Ruma Honeybottoms, though, is another tough one. Maybe enough to get some to quit, and was actually where I ended my first play session. To be fair, I was playing late, was pretty exhausted, and I handicapped myself in a few other ways too, so it didn't take me terribly long when I came back firing on all cylinders. But she still stands out to me because of this. And while the Ghost Train is appropriately difficult for the area, I still want to make note of its unique mechanics, you fighting not one opponent but several that come out of different cars, and you being confined to a small cart that you need to position to make sure you're not directly in the line of fire, with smaller enemies trying to move you about to screw with you. And we haven't talked about the arcade shooter fights yet, have we? Since you can move around freely on the screen, each of these tend to have a lot more projectiles for you to weave around, and spacing is really important, especially once you get the bombs on Island 2, which are powerful but you need to be close to use. It can wind up feeling like a bullet hell at points, and Dr. Call takes this to the extreme. Him starting out with a few short phases, but the bulk of his fight having him just shooting out attacks in all directions, while walls come into frame to further restrict your movements. The other shooter fight for Island 3, Cala Maria, is the only one in the game that I'd call unfair. First stage has her hitting you with 2 attacks at once, one from her, one from a sea friend she summons. While each is easy enough to avoid on their own, when combined, some feel like they don't give you enough dodging options. Still, if you're good and lucky, you'll survive. Second phase has her occasionally petrifying you so you can't move, but as long as you steadily take out the enemies she summons that fire attacks, it's manageable. Not so with the last phase, where you have to navigate a narrow cave, move around obstacles, and avoid a slightly undulating attack. If you get frozen, you need to have your path clear for a short span, which isn't always going to be possible, so you can eat butts. This tends to be where I spend the most time in a playthrough, it usually taking 30 or more minutes in a 4-hour run. Sweet Christmas, love the boss, hate the fight. Inkwell Hell has your last 2 battles, King Dice being the first. You parry a dice, which can roll a 1 through 3, to move across a board made up of 3 sets of 3 mini-bosses and a save space, and at the end a start over and goal. Each set has a bonus heart, which if you manage to snag, means you can get up to 3 HP over your typical max. Each mini-boss is set, so you can try to plan your route around either getting the hearts and free spaces, or which one you just find the most manageable. and I swear they changed how this worked. When I first played, I remember the bonus hearts also working as free spaces, so you could just make it all the way to the goal without any extra fights, but now, you still have to battle whoever's space you land on, regardless if you get a bonus. Anyway, none of the mini-bosses are particularly hard, it's just a matter of not screwing up too much to conserve your hearts and timing your parries to get the right rolls. The fight against King Dice at the end is short, but it can be kinda hard to get over his wave of cards. If you don't know the cheese for this part, it can be easy to get wiped quickly by him and feel cheated, so do as I do. The final battle is against the devil, and it's not the hardest in the game, but it's still challenging enough, and there's a lot of variety in his attacks based on different interpretations of the guy that I still think he's a really cool fight. There's also a few battles that have secret phases as well, if you do something specific at certain points. If you don't know what I mean, try not shooting the onion for the root pack or turning small when Jimmy psychically scans you. It's neat that they include little bonuses like this to discover and play around with. None of the bosses have HP bars, but if you fail, you get a line with a gold flag at the end, and several segments to indicate different phases, with your guy running along to give you an idea on how close you were to getting to the next part, or even winning. It can be really motivating if you were almost there, encouraging you to immediately try again, though the opposite can also be true if you were nowhere close. There's a total of 6 run and gun stages, along with the tutorial. And hey, if you're starting up a new game, even if you know how everything works, you still want to do the tutorial since it nets you a coin, which is a limited resource. As for the other 6, they're pleasant. Unlike boss difficulty, which can fluctuate greatly, these all feel like they have a good progression to them, the first one being the easiest and the last 2 being the hardest. While there are a few stage gimmicks, like a vertical section in one, gravity flipping in another, and an octopus you have to ride later on, for the most part, they're just largely basic platforming. They're not even required for progression, but there are 3 reasons that I'd say make them worth completing. The 5 coins each contain, which are essential for building your ideal loadout and affect your score, the variety of enemies, which, while not as impressive as the bosses, are still fun, and the environments. Since you're dealing with much more than a single screen like you get for the boss arenas, given how much longer these areas are, there's a lot more variety in the setting, the platforms, and the backgrounds, and with the visuals being one of the big selling points of the game, you wouldn't want to miss them. Plus, it's nice to just play around with something different once in a while. Still though, these stages don't feel nearly as creative as the boss fights that are the main focus of the game. It kinda feels like it was originally meant to be a run and gun game, and indeed, that's even how it was marketed, but then they pivoted to making the game more of a boss rush, with how basic the stages feel and how you're able to skip them. It doesn't quite scratch the same itch that Mega Man, Sonic, and recently Mario Wonder do with their level design, but it's not the biggest issue, given how good the rest of the game is. There's also a set of 3 mausoleums, which beating will net you a new special. You have to defend an urn from pink ghosts that can't be shot, only parried. While the first one is pretty simple, it gradually gets more frantic, and it can be really fun to see how many ghosts you can combo without touching the ground in the third. So yeah, the standard stages aren't the game's strong point, but they don't need to be, and are still fun enough in the short stints you get them. Oh, and if you get through all the stages without fighting anything, you get a little bonus. I have not. I feel like I shouldn't need to say too much about the visuals, since that was the main thing that initially drew a lot of attention to the game, but each sprite is hand-drawn, in the style of old cartoons, most obviously the rubber hose style. On top of that, there's a filter over it to make it look a bit grainy, like you're actually watching things play out on old rolls of film. As if that weren't impressive enough, there's a ton of animations for each character. When the battle starts up, when they attack, when they move into their next phase, when they're defeated. I remember reading about the insane amount of individual drawings they did for this one, and it was staggering. I'm gonna avoid looking up the exact number, just because I think I'd start to hyperventilate. Even the backgrounds get a ton of care. Fun little details like the honeycombs in Rumor Honeybottom's arena being set up like cubicles, the mini-bosses with King Dice having some pretty creepy imagery like the old cartoons that seem geared to traumatize children rather than entertain, and the coaster for Beppy's fight coming into sight a little before it makes it into the foreground. A few backgrounds, like in Jimmy and Matchstick's fights, were actually handmade sets that were assembled and then filmed, the camera orbiting them. It's just a delightful game to look at and to try to take in all the details on display. Even with this being a style of animation from long before my time, I can still appreciate it. While I think the gameplay is strong enough for the title to hang its hat on, at the same time, all the effort makes it really special and difficult for even those that find the game too hard to criticize. The sound is likewise very quaint. The sound effects are very cartoony, like how it sounds like porcelain shattering when you take a hit. While there isn't much voice work, some enemies have villainous laughs or exaggerated screams instead of actual lines, and when you start a challenge, an announcer that sounds like he's coming on over the radio quotes out-of-style phrases. The music is equally rustic, sounding like it's being played on antique instruments and meant to fit more a scene in an old cartoon rather than a video game level. A lot of them sound a little nefarious, given the cast of shady characters you have to face, but there's some whimsy and frenzy mixed in, and the haunted mausoleums sound pretty spooky. There's even a few vocal tracks done by Barbershop Quartet, and a special song for King Dice that's a shame that it doesn't play for longer than a single screen at a time. While overall, it's not a style I typically go for, I have to admit that it really pulls the whole feel that the game's going for together, and makes the experience feel very authentic. The game has 3 difficulties, chosen as you select the fight. Simple, normal, and once you beat the game, expert. Simple cuts out a boss phase, letting you clock out early, though doing this doesn't count as beating it, and you won't be able to advance past the dice house. Normal is normal. It's how you're supposed to play it. And while I was hoping it would add a new phase or element to a fight, the few experts I tried only seemed to have the bosses attack more aggressively, and maybe give them a bit more health. While not quite as exciting as I was hoping, it does give you a neat little gold flag and bragging rights. As for general difficulty, this is a pretty hard game. For a while, I think people were calling it the Dark Souls of platformers or something stupid like that, and I've joked with friends that if this had come out first, Dark Souls might have been called the Cuphead of adventure games. Challenging but fair is the most common way of referring to it, though I'd argue that Cala Maria crosses a line, but otherwise agree. I don't think I realized just how difficult Cuphead was until I started watching other people play it. While hard, with the game throwing a lot at you with little room for error, since pattern recognition plays such a big part, I figured most confident players would be able to win if they just stuck with it. Then I heard one YouTuber talk about giving up on Beppy, but since he was more famous for his opinions than his gameplay, I didn't think too much of it. Then a group of streamers touched on the game and said how none of them had beaten it, and though none went into detail, the fact that they considered doing so a feat made me wonder. Then I watched a few other people give it a go. Some were just doing it for a lark, so it wasn't surprising when they didn't do more than a stream, but 2 in particular were picking up the game pretty fast, maybe even doing better than me in my initial run, and one was even known for being a fiend at Jump King, so I felt sure that each could clear it, and then the streams just stopped. While I still contend that they could have beaten it, they had the skills, I had to admit to myself that the game may be a little much for most people. While I think that if you're good at platformers, good at pattern recognition, like a challenge, and have decent perseverance, you'll come out on top, a lot of people do seem to call it early. I kinda wish that simple was a viable way to clear the game, just so more people could experience it. While I get that normal is the intended experience, at the same time, letting other people use the lower difficulty would not invalidate my normal runs. But hey, the creators are free to pursue their vision, even if I do think it's a little harsh. Going back to general points though, if you are skilled enough to beat it, it's one of those games that's interesting because different people will find different parts more challenging. Some bosses seem thrown in at different points in the game due more to theming than difficulty, but it's entirely possible that the ones I called weak links like Sally's stage play will actually be harder for some people than Cagney Carnation. I watched a review back in the day from someone who liked the game but complained that Briny Beard had way more health than anyone else, and I kinda tilted my head, thinking he wasn't that bad. And as much as I complain about Cala Maria, there's a chance that someone out there is gonna say that she's one of the easier ones, though if they do so in the comments, I will punch them in the kidneys. My point is that while the difficulty might feel inconsistent, it might have more to do with you just being able to pick up certain fights quicker than others, and hearing different but just as valid opinions and experiences kinda adds an extra layer of fun to the game. Lastly, there is a 2-player mode, which kinda goes along with difficulty. Pretend I have friends for this section. The 2 big differences are that your damage is halved, and you can revive a fallen player by using a parry on their ghost before it floats off screen. Damage will go back to normal though when you're down to a single player. Personally, I think this mode is harder. While you could hypothetically use the revive to become immortal, there's also a fair chance that rushing to save your partner will get you killed as well. With your damage halved though, you're only as strong as your weaker player, since the better won't be able to rack up damage as quickly. Plus, a big part of my own strategy is just restarting the battle if I make a mistake too early, which would be awkward to do if you need to secure another person's approval as well. While I haven't played too much of this mode myself, I have watched 2 of my siblings attempt it, one of which was a bit better than me at video games when we were kids. If I remember correctly, There were a lot of times they would win when they were down to just one player, when damage was normal again. But end of the day, they gave up somewhere on Inkwell too. Maybe someone out there will prove me wrong, maybe this is actually the ideal way to play at high skill levels, but to me, it just feels like an extra layer of difficulty. It does give me an idea for a challenge run though, trying to help someone else through the game while clearing fights with both of us alive as much as possible. We'll call it the hard carry. Now who can I convince to attempt this with me? It does feel a little condescending after all. So hey, Cuphead, great game, one of my favorites. And there's been something that I've been wanting to try out when I review something other than Mega Man that I'll call platformers of extraordinary merit, where the more I like a game, the bigger the palm I write. Like haiku for if I liked it, a limerick if I'd recommend it, and a sonnet if I adore it. If it's meh, it gets nothing, and if I dislike, hate, or despise, it gets the same but in reverse. So a rating system, but a more fluid one. And if this bombs and people say that it's cringe, I never do this again and pretend it never happened. So what'll Cuphead get? Plan a visit to the Inkwell Isles, but avoid making deal with the devil. He'll force you through many tests and trials. In the chaos and suffering he'll revel. You'll have to rely on jumps and spacing, finger guns to defeat your freakish foes. Use death screen to plan out battles pacing, as each and every loss adds to your woes. But learn the patterns and how to parry. Collect each gun, special, and all of the charms. Give careful thought to which ones you carry. Soon you'll be the one delivering harm. Face various baddies across the map. Collect your wits and prepare for a scrap. Anyway, that'll do it, so thanks for watching. Feel free to tell me what you think of Cuphead and if you've beaten it. If there's any other poetry formats I should use, and maybe consider subscribing if you like the video. Good day for a swell battle.